A courtroom in Nuremberg goes silent. A young Polish woman stands up, and without saying a word yet, she lifts the hem of her skirt. What the judges see next is a leg carved by someone who was not trying to heal it, deep scars running from knee to ankle, muscle that no longer sits where muscle should, a limb that has been cut open, infected on purpose, and cut open again. She does not flinch. She has done this before, in front of doctors who called it science. Now she is doing it in front of men who are about to decide whether that word, science, gets to protect the man who did this to her. Her name is Jadwiga Zido. She is not a lawyer. She is not a forensic expert. She is a survivor, and on this particular morning in a converted courthouse in occupied Germany, her body is the single most damning piece of evidence anyone in that room will present. In a few months, her testimony is going to convict a Nazi doctor, put him away for the rest of his life. At least, that's what everyone sitting in that courtroom on this day believes is about to happen. Stay with this one to the end, because what actually happens to that sentence afterward is not the ending you're expecting. This is the story of Fritz Fischer, a German surgeon who spent the war cutting into the legs of healthy young women, and the one moment in a Nuremberg courtroom that made sure he could never call himself just a doctor again. By the time Zido stood up in that courtroom, the world already knew, in broad strokes, that Nazi doctors had run experiments on concentration camp prisoners. What the world didn't have, in most cases, was a living person standing in a courtroom who could show a judge, in real time, exactly what experiment had meant in practice. Paperwork can describe a procedure. It cannot make a room go silent the way a living scar can. Fischer was not some low-ranking camp worker who got swept up in something bigger than him. He was a trained surgeon in his early 30s, an SS officer, and the deputy of Karl Gebhardt, one of the most senior and best-connected physicians in the entire Nazi medical system. Gebhardt wasn't a fringe figure either. He was Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, a man with real influence inside the SS, and in 1942 he had a problem he wanted solved. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were dying from infected battlefield wounds by the thousands, and Gebhardt was convinced the new sulfonamide drugs everyone in military medical circles was talking about didn't actually work as well as claimed. He needed real wounds on real bodies to test that theory properly. Not theoretical wounds, not animal wounds, human ones inflicted under controlled conditions on people who couldn't refuse. Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp built north of Berlin specifically to hold female prisoners, had exactly the kind of captive population Gebhardt was looking for. The women chosen were mostly Polish, many of them still in their teens or early 20s, almost all of them former members of the Polish resistance who had been arrested together and transported to the camp as a group after a Gestapo crackdown on the underground movement in Lublin. Prisoners in the camp started calling them the rabbits, because that's exactly what they had become to the men running the experiments. Test subjects, not patients. Fischer, acting as Gebhardt's right hand and lead surgeon on the project, would cut into their legs under minimal anesthesia, and then deliberately introduce bacteria into the open wound, sometimes glass fragments, sometimes splinters of wood. The goal was to recreate as closely as possible the kind of dirty, contaminated battlefield injury a soldier might get from a landmine or a piece of shrapnel, and then test whether the new sulfa drugs could actually stop that kind of infection from spreading through the body. Post-operative care afterward was minimal to non-existent. Some of the women went through this more than once. Some of them did not survive the first round. The experiments ran in staggered rounds through 1942 and into 1943. And Fischer wasn't a passive assistant standing at Gebhardt's elbow. He was the one physically performing many of the procedures himself, operating on dozens of women across the course of the program. Historical accounts place him personally involved in surgical procedures on at least 74 separate occasions, which means this wasn't a single lapse in judgment during wartime chaos. It was a sustained, repeated, deliberate practice that he carried out again and again over the better part of a year, refining his technique on each new prisoner brought into the surgical block. And this is worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts directly against the version of the story where Fischer is just a subordinate who followed one bad order. Gebhardt designed the program and answered to Himmler for its results. Fischer designed nothing. He simply did the cutting over and over on woman after woman because his superior told him it mattered more than the fact that these were healthy, unconsenting human beings strapped to a table. Jadwiga Zido was one of the ones who lived. On November 22, 1942, Fischer and Oberhäuser operated on her leg, opening it and infecting it in the same procedure the rest of the group had already gone through. She carried the physical result of that day for the rest of her life, and in December of 1946, she carried it into a Nuremberg courtroom. Understand what these women were before Ravensbrück. Most of them were not soldiers. They were students, couriers, typists, teenagers who had joined the Polish underground because their country was occupied and somebody had to carry messages, print pamphlets, move people across borders. They were arrested in sweeps, interrogated, and shipped west. Once inside the camp, they had already survived the ordinary brutality of forced labor, starvation rations, and roll calls that could last for hours in freezing weather. The experiments were layered on top of all of that. Prisoners inside Ravensbrück knew what was happening to the rabbits almost as soon as it started, because the women who came back from the hospital block, when they came back at all, couldn't hide the aftermath. Some walked with permanent limps. Some never walked normally again. A small resistance network inside the camp began secretly documenting names, dates, and details of the operations, smuggling notes out in scraps of fabric and memorized fragments, specifically so that if any of them survived the war, there would be a record no one could later deny. That documentation is part of why what happened to Zito and the other rabbits is so precisely dated today, down to the exact day of specific operations. It wasn't guesswork reconstructed after the fact. It was written down in secret by women who suspected they might not live to testify themselves. The trial became known as the Doctors Trial, the first of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings run by an American military court. 23 defendants in the dock, all but 3 of them physicians, all accused of experimenting on camp prisoners without consent. Fischer was one of them, so was Gebhardt. So was Oberhäuser, the only woman among the accused. For weeks, the testimony had stayed clinical. Medical records as exhibits, expert witnesses using careful, distant language borrowed from surgical journals, defense lawyers arguing this was legitimate wartime research, that soldiers were dying and hard choices had to be made, that the men in the dock were simply following the accepted science of their time. Strip the words prisoner and consent out of the description, and on paper it starts to sound almost procedural. That was the whole defense. It only works as long as nobody has to look directly at the result. All of that changed on one specific day. And then, on December 17th, 1946, Jadwiga Zito was called to the stand. She didn't need an expert witness to translate what had happened to her. She was the evidence. A medical expert stood beside her and explained, procedure by procedure, exactly what the scars in front of the judges represented. The infection, the removed muscle, the permanent damage that no operation could undo. But it was Zito standing there, in that room, showing her leg to 4 American judges, that turned the trial from an argument about medical ethics in the abstract into a reckoning with one specific act, done to one specific person by men sitting a few feet away from her. People who were in that courtroom described a silence that didn't happen for the expert witnesses. It happened for her. Part of what made it land so hard was the contrast with everything the courtroom had heard before her. Journalists covering the trial had already started to describe a kind of numbness setting in among the press corps and even some of the tribunal staff, week after week of atrocity testimony flattening into routine. Then a young woman stands up, lifts her skirt, and says almost nothing at all, and the room remembers all at once that every document on that evidence table represents an actual body. That's the specific power eyewitness testimony has that documentary evidence doesn't. A piece of paper can be filed away and half forgotten. A person standing in front of you, showing you exactly what was done, cannot. This is the part of the story we're not going to dwell on in graphic detail, because it doesn't need embellishment to land, and because what mattered in that courtroom wasn't the clinical description, it was the human being standing in front of the judges who had lived through it. What matters for Fischer's story is what came after. For the first time in the trial, one specific defendant's specific actions were now permanently, visibly attached to one specific survivor. Fischer couldn't hide behind the word the experiments anymore. He had done this to her. The trial ran for months after that testimony, one of the longest and most document-heavy of the entire Nuremberg process. 85 witnesses took the stand over the course of the proceedings. Nearly 1,500 documents were entered into evidence. On August 20th, 1947, the American judges, Walter Beals, Harold Sebring, and Johnson Crawford, delivered their verdict, closing out a trial that had lasted the better part of a year. 16 of the 23 doctors were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death, including Karl Gebhardt, Fischer's superior, who would be executed the following June alongside the others condemned that day. 7 were acquitted entirely, cleared of the charges against them. And 9, including Fritz Fischer, were sentenced to prison, with terms ranging from a handful of years up to the harshest sentence short of execution the tribunal could hand down. Fischer's sentence was life imprisonment, not death, life. The tribunal drew a line between Gebhardt, who had ordered the experiments and organized the entire program at the highest level, and Fischer, who had carried it out with his own hands, but hadn't designed it. It's a distinction that says something uncomfortable about how courts weigh guilt. The man who gave the orders and the man who held the scalpel did not receive the same sentence, even though both of them stood over the same operating tables, and both of them knew exactly what they were doing to Jadwiga Zito and the other women like her. Herta Oberhäuser, the third doctor most directly involved, received 20 years, the lightest sentence of the 3. Gebhardt was hanged on June 1648, alongside the other doctors condemned to death in that verdict. His name went into the history of that trial as one of the architects of a program that mutilated dozens of women in pursuit of a scientific question that historians examining the surviving research data have since argued produced findings of dubious scientific value even by the standards of the doctors who ran it. That's a detail worth sitting with, too. Much of what was supposedly learned from these procedures wasn't reliable. The suffering wasn't in service of some breakthrough that changed battlefield medicine. The conditions of the experiments, unconsenting subjects, inconsistent methods, no real controls, made the resulting data scientifically shaky at best, which means the women who went through this didn't just suffer for someone else's cause. In a very real sense, they suffered for close to nothing. Remember what I told you at the start, that everyone in that courtroom believed they had just watched Fischer disappear for the rest of his life. Here's the part of this story that should make you angry, and it has almost nothing to do with the operating table. Fritz Fischer did not serve a life sentence. His punishment was cut down to 15 years, and this wasn't some isolated act of mercy specific to his case. In January of 1951, John J. McCloy, the American official serving as High Commissioner over occupied West Germany, signed off on a sweeping wave of clemency for the Nuremberg convicted war criminals still sitting in Landsberg prison. Out of the roughly 89 Germans still incarcerated there from all 12 of the Nuremberg follow-up trials combined, the vast majority received reduced sentences that January, including commutations for 10 of the 15 men still under death sentences at the time. The official reasoning involved legal technicalities and appeals for clemency. The unofficial reasoning, the one most historians point to, was Cold War politics. West Germany was becoming a key American ally against the Soviet Union, and Washington wanted a rehabilitated, cooperative West German public, not a country full of resentment over what many Germans at the time saw as victor's justice. Fischer's 15-year sentence and his release from prison by 1954 fits squarely inside that same climate of quiet, politically convenient forgiveness. He walked free years before his own judges ever intended, and by the time he died, his medical license had been reinstated in West Germany. The judges, who sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison, never got the outcome they handed down in that courtroom. The post-war system that was supposed to hold men like Fischer accountable let the sentence quietly shrink year after year, administrative decision after administrative decision, until almost nothing was left of it. Herta Oberhäuser's story followed almost the same path, and in some ways it's even harder to sit with. Released years early for good behavior, she rebuilt a career as a family doctor in West Germany, treating ordinary patients, including children, for years, without any of them knowing what she had done at Ravensbrück. It was only when a former Ravensbrück prisoner happened to recognize her face, years later, in an ordinary waiting room, that anyone reported her. Only then did German medical authorities finally strip her license in 1958, more than a decade after the verdict that was supposed to have already dealt with her. So when you ask what Jadwiga Zito's testimony actually accomplished, the honest answer is complicated. It didn't get Fischer executed. It didn't even keep him in prison for life, the way the judges intended. What it did was something smaller, and in its own way just as important. It made sure that when the history of that trial was written down, Fischer's name would be permanently attached to hers, not to an abstract program, not to a paragraph about medical experiments, and to one specific woman standing in front of a courtroom, showing the world exactly what had been done to her body and daring anyone to call it science. There's also a legal legacy here that outlasted every individual sentence, commuted or not. The doctor's trial, the one Zito testified at, is the trial that produced the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles about consent and human experimentation that judges wrote directly into their verdict in response to exactly the kind of thing that had been done to her. Every modern rule requiring informed consent before a person can be enrolled in a medical study traces its lineage back to that courtroom, back to judges who had just spent months hearing testimony like hers and needed to write down, formally, why what these doctors did was not science. It was a crime. Zito never asked to become part of the foundation of modern medical ethics. She just stood up and showed her leg. But that's what her testimony, and testimony like it from the other rabbits who took the stand, ended up building. The judges who heard her that day believed her enough to convict a trained surgeon and sentence him to life in prison. That the system later failed to enforce its own sentence doesn't erase what that testimony did in the room. It just means the story of accountability didn't end the way it should have. There's a version of this story where the ending is simple. Bad man does terrible things, gets caught, pays for it. That's not what happened here, and it's worth being honest about why that matters. The uncomfortable truth is that accountability for atrocities like this one was never guaranteed to be permanent. It depended on political will that could, and did, change with the geopolitics of a new decade. The same governments that prosecuted these men in 1947 were, within a handful of years, more interested in a stable, allied West Germany than in finishing out sentences against surgeons who had already served enough time to satisfy the paperwork. Zito's testimony survives as a fixed historical fact. Fischer's punishment did not survive nearly as well. So here's the question for you. When a court gets the verdict right but the system lets the punishment quietly disappear years later, is that still justice, or is it just a delay? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.